Hi, Kathy. How are
Hi,
you?
Isabella.
It's a great honor and privilege to have you here, and thank you so much for spending this time with me.
I think your project is phenomenal, and I'm really honored to be part of it. You have such fantastic people, so I'm in awe of what you've put together, truly.
Oh, thank you so much. Could you please share a bit about your music journey and your story?
Sure, I can try. I'm not sure it's not a terribly interesting one. My my parents knew almost nothing about music. They liked classical music, but otherwise knew nothing. So we had no instruments in the house, and we knew no musicians. But my father was an academic and had a sabbatical one summer, and we rented a house that had a piano in the basement. I was 5 years old, and for some reason I liked it. That's all I could say. And my mother had taken piano lessons briefly and disastrously as a child, but remembered how to read the treble clef. So she taught me the treble clef, and I still remember there was some book there that had Beethoven's Ode to Joy, and I still remember it started on a B. It's funny how like I might forget a piece I learned a month ago, but the piece I learned when I was 5 years old is embedded forever. Anyway, I fell in love. And then we moved into an apartment in St. Louis, which is where my father taught, and the neighbor had a piano. So I went there. And my parents resisted getting an instrument, but finally got an upright, and I did start lessons when I was 7. But no one ever thought I would be a musician. I think that in some ways it kind of, maybe it was good that my parents had no interest. Certainly no one ever made me practice. In fact, if anything, my mother tried to get me to practice less. She didn't understand why I wanted to spend all that time at the piano. So I think that it became sort of my place. Like, I think that can go both ways, right? Of course, it's fantastic to have parents who can be really engaged with and help you with what you're doing. And my parents couldn't do that. On the other hand, I think it's sort of also helpful if music is your own thing and you've come at it by yourself. And I've had a lot of friends who were fantastic players, but as they became adults and after they'd gone to Juilliard or whatever, they stopped because they realized they'd done it all along because someone else wanted them to. I never did it because anyone else wanted me to, because they didn't want me to. So anyway, I took lessons then. I did not have great teaching, I would say. And it wasn't really till I went to Interlaken as a 16-year-old that it occurred to me that I might want to become a pianist. My household was very academic, which is probably why I do write and lecture a lot as well as play. That's sort of the milieu that I grew up being really comfortable in. So I've sort of been able to bring it together with playing. I started out going to Oberlin because they had a 5-year program, and I'd be able to do both liberal arts and piano. And I thought that way I wouldn't have to really decide yet what I wanted to do. But as it turned out, I wasn't very happy there for a whole multitude of reasons, and ended up actually going to New England Conservatory, where you are, in Boston, and loved Boston. Discovered I loved big cities. Went to Juilliard because I was so happy to go to New York then. So that's my journey. It was a pretty indirect journey. I never imagined myself as a big concert pianist. I wish I had, but I didn't. I never entered international competitions or anything like that. It just wasn't part of my self-image.
Well, everybody has their own journey, and I can just see the passion that behind everything that you do that drives you. Do you feel like you had a couple of people who were influential, not just music, but maybe perhaps other things in life early on?
I did. And it's interesting you said not just music, but even though I didn't know that I wanted to be a musician, I do think the people that meant the most to me have always, outside my family, have always been musicians, the sort of older role model people. I had a piano teacher in St. Louis, and he didn't help me much technically, and I've always been very sorry about that because it's a big hole in my training. But he was really passionate about music, and he passed that on, and he was wonderful about making a really strong link between student and teacher. So I would say that in my sort of early teenage years, he had a huge impact on me and on my relationship to music. And after that, I guess two musicians especially come to mind. One is no longer alive, but Patricia Zander, who was who I sort of took illegitimate lessons from while I was at New England Conservatory. She wasn't my teacher, but I went and played for her a lot. She never charged me. I babysat for Jessica, who now, of course, is more than is a very full-grown adult, has her own children. But I knew Jessica from the age of 2 on, and I knew the whole family well. And Patricia then, over many, many years, became a close friend. Sort of, how people sort of eventually shift from being your teacher to being your friend. But I had just enormous admiration for her. She had the liveliest mind, perhaps, that I've ever known. She read about everything. And even at the end, when she was so sick and she couldn't sleep because she was always in pain, she stayed up all night reading. And she could talk about anything. So Patricia had a huge impact on me. And I still remember her sound at the piano, and it will always be with me. And the other person who's had a huge impact on me is Gil Kalish, who was my doctoral teacher, but so much that doesn't begin to say what he's been and is. So I first met him when I went to Tanglewood, and I went to Tanglewood for 2 summers and worked with him there, and then went to Stony Brook and did my DMA with him. And now have an apartment literally around the corner from him in New York. And I could almost say that I chose it for that. Of course I didn't, but it's a lovely happenstance. And he too has been a fantastic role model because like Patricia, his career is completely unconventional. I mean, he went to Columbia University. He didn't start out with a big solo career, but he's made a career that is so sort of multifaceted. Again, he's been able to choose his own journey, and I guess that's what's so appealing. And he's been incredibly generous to me in countless ways, personal and musical, and such a model in terms of just his sense of adventure in repertoire, his ability to be both a wonderful collaborator and a soloist, a teacher among the very best in the world. The other person I would add there, although he's somebody that I've come to know later, would be Richard Good, who I have known now for many decades, and I think whose sound at the piano has had the biggest impact on me possible. I just think that the way he plays the piano is also the way he is as a person. And of course, that's such a wonderful thing. He has been so kind and so generous to me. And I just think he is such a loving, gentle man. And that when he plays Schubert, that's what you hear. And what a wonderful thing to hear. So I feel enormously grateful to him, both for just the personal relationship with him, but also for the modeling of what it is to be a great artist and to have your personhood heard in the instrument you play. So those are people who've really had a big impact in my life in many ways.
Those people I know that are among the best of the best and the kindest, and who really have a heart of educator and a music parents to nurture.
Well, that's actually, I don't know that I've ever heard that phrase, but that's a great phrase, a music parent, because I guess that's what we all kind of are and hope to be in many ways.
You've devoted a lot of time on French music, and particularly Debussy. Could you go back a little bit in time? How you started? You could share a bit of that journey.
Yeah, although it's actually a very recent part of my life. So I grew up with teachers who'd been trained mostly in Germanic music. And my parents are from Vienna. So when music was played in our house, it was always Mozart and Beethoven and Schubert. I'm sure there was never a recording of Debussy played in my household. My father loved Carmen, so that was there, and he loved Bolero. But I think that would have been it and both of those are really more Spanish in a way than they are French anyway, right? So I played almost no French music until I was like 45 years old, literally. I mean, I have a couple of memories, and they're kind of silly, and in a way they're kind of humiliating. But I remember the first time that I went into my teacher when I was, I don't know, 13 or whatever, did assign me to Debussy Preludes, Maiden with the Flaxen Hair and Puerta del Vino. And I don't honestly remember for sure which one I played first. They both have a lot of accidentals, and whichever it was a disaster. I apparently deleted quite a large number of those accidentals. And I still remember my teacher saying, let's go out for a Coke today instead of having a lesson. that was it for Debussy, I think, until I was at New England Conservatory, at which time we must have been studying, maybe we were studying whole tone scales. And somehow I learned voile, and I played it in my theory class. We must each have been asked to play something. And I remember this lovely teacher, he was so sweet and so tactful. And he said afterwards, oh, your pedaling was so interesting. You never lifted the pedal at all. That was it. That was it for a very, very long time. And then once I was teaching at Lawrence University, I had a sabbatical coming up, and my husband and I had two small children, and we decided, I now think we were quite daring, but we decided we would spend a year in Paris. And then it went in this order. It wasn't, oh, I have this thing I want to do and I can do it best in Paris. It was, I'd like to spend a year in Paris. What can I do to justify that? So I obviously decided I should maybe learn something about French piano music. And that was really when it started. And I was 45 years old, or nearly 45 years old. I went to something called the French Piano Institute. I'd actually done that a couple of years before when we were spending a summer in London, and started getting introduced to the music. But it really came in a very backward direction, which is that I got fascinated by French culture. I worked very hard to learn French. I didn't know French at all, but I took the first year of French at Lawrence before moving there, and then studied hard there. And my French is now sort of acceptable, far from fabulous, but serviceable. And I love Paris. I love France. I love Paris. I love the sound of the language. I'm kind of a foodie, so I love the food. I think the city's incredibly beautiful. I just got fascinated also by the poetry, by the architecture, and started to realize that Debussy was sort of the perfect in, because he was so, I think not even consciously so, but he imbibed everything from that city, good and bad. And so all the sort of cultural trends, the fact that he was living at the time that France was becoming a colonial power. And so he's writing pieces that couldn't have existed had France not been acquiring colonies in Northern Africa and in Southeast Asia. And he's immersed in the literature And so he's writing songs that are based on Pierre Louis and on Baudelaire. And then we find Baudelaire coming up in the piano music. And he loves fairy tales because he wants nothing more than to sort of remove himself from daily life. And so all of these things, all of the issues about race and minstrel shows and cakewalks, which are thorny, to put it mildly. And Debussy's very racist. If you read his letters, they're blatantly racist. I think that would probably be true of the letters of 99% of his countrymen. So it's not a sort of, it's not so much a personal issue, although it's not as if one can't fault him. And those are the sorts of issues that I thought it was so fascinating to find getting played out in the music. And you know, then you start to listen to the music as well, once you're sort of pulled in. And the difference in how I think I started to think about Debussy than I think I thought about earlier Germanic music was so helpful to me, because the beginning to, I think, listening for sound is something nobody had talked to me that much about it, actually. And if you don't listen for sound and color in Debussy, there's not that much left. I mean, there are things, but that's what it's about. So that was revelatory, and it's also why I love teaching it, because I think it just opens people's ears to the infinite possibilities of the piano. I think this music came fairly naturally, because I think I've always been more comfortable playing softly than loudly, and also more comfortable playing music that isn't highly virtuosic than music that is. So I think that in that sense, this music didn't feel like a really big leap to me technically, but I think it did feel really stimulating in terms of how it felt on the piano. It's very tactile music. It's music that feels really good to play. I think the sort of sensuality of French culture in some way is there, just in the way the piano feels to Debussy. And I also think I was so interested. Since I was talking on the video about Maiden with the Flaxen Hair, I went on YouTube to listen. And I was fascinated to see that there were recordings by Oistrakh and Heifetz and Richard Stoltzman, you know, these great musicians on other instruments. So of course I listened a little bit. And what really struck me was I like it so much better on the piano. And I thought that was it was such an interesting idea, that the neutrality of the piano somehow offered the flatness of the given sound on the piano gave more possibilities somehow than all the vibrato in the world. And I can't tell you exactly why that's true, but I felt like it was written for the right instrument, and I'm glad that that's where I'm playing it, and that I can think about the options of piano sound, because it's so malleable. And I think he really is this sort of gateway into what comes next in so many ways. You know, the atonality is very gentle, but he really is moving away from writing in keys, and he's willing to, this is something that really interests me and something I love. I love his etudes, actually. And it's partly because he's willing to do the most unpredictable things. And the idea of sort of non sequiturs of life proceeding in completely unexpected directions that correspond much more to the unconscious than they do to a sort of conscious planned trajectory. I'm actually just about to go off on a weekend retreat with my students, with someone who, with two people from the college at Lawrence University, not the conservatory, one who teaches Southeast Asian history, and her partner, who is a Jungian psychoanalyst. And we have put together a program of music that is somehow based on dreams. And we're going to learn from them more about dreams in different cultures and the ways that they've been studied by psychologists and by neuroscientists. And I think that Debussy is, I mean, who, if you think about composers that you identify with dreams, Debussy would probably be the first person who comes to mind, right? And that whole era, Scriabin as well, and maybe Schoenberg if you're thinking more about nightmares, or Berg, but all of them, I think, are trying to go inside and move away from the sort of logic that that music had sort of espoused earlier, when it was really about putting a form on life, which isn't very formed, right? Which is in fact by its nature kind of chaotic. So I think that's really an interesting part of Debussy, that he's one of the first who's willing and interested in doing that.
Do you think that there's a way to introduce French music in general, in particular Debussy and Ravel, earlier, even though there are simpler pieces, but I still compare, of course, to other composers' music. This is a very much less played.
You're so right. I actually just met with a prospective student, a really, really good pianist. And I was trying to ask what literature he'd played. And he said, well, this big gap, and my teacher just said he was so embarrassed about it, is that I've played nothing impressionistic. I've played nothing by Debussy or Ravel. And I think a lot of students play the first arabesque. We hear that at auditions a great deal, but we hear almost nothing else, I must say. I think the issue is that it's all, this music is a lot about ambiguity, and that makes it hard to teach and hard to play. Right? That it doesn't offer this same clear-cut line in. Like, you play Bach and you can say to students, don't use the pedal, okay? Or use very little pedal. Maybe you could put it down for a moment here as a sort of band-aid, but it's clear, right? You play Debussy and you're supposed to use a lot of pedal, but on the other hand, you could use way too much, or you could use way too little. And how do you teach a student that? And yes, you could play legato here and staccato here. A lot of the time, you're supposed to be playing something in between legato and staccato, and that's really hard for students. So I think that's why it's not taught very much. Also, students would rather play loud and fast than slow and quiet often. But that, none of that is to say that it shouldn't be taught. I think it has to be taught via the ears, and that's more difficult. I mean, things can't be quite as prescribed as they maybe can. It's hard to break it down into clear 4-measure phrases. It's not as amenable to precise instruction. And that, of course, is its virtue, because I think it encourages students to listen. What kind of sound can you get there? Can you make a difference between a piano and a pianissimo? What happens if you hold that bass note in the pedal? Can you flutter the pedal? I mean, there's so many, it's about questions rather than answers. And I think that's really important. I think we all tend too much to want everything to be precise, but I do think that it's challenging that way. But there are some loud and fast pieces too, and I think like What the West Wind Saw, for a student who's sort of, who gets around really well. I have one young student, and I gave him a choice of Debussy pieces, and that was the one he chose. So I thought that was kind of revealing. And I think Fireworks is also for piece, the last of the preludes. But both of those are for kids who are getting around the keyboard very, very well already. They're hard. And I think they could easily be paired then happily with one of the quieter preludes, and then you kind of get a joining of those two different worlds.
But I'm so fascinated by also listening to your recording, that your pedal use, because one of the biggest challenges for playing Debussy is the what to do with the pedal. And there's a sostenuto pedal as well. There's so many long notes that you simply cannot hold.
I
Could
know.
you share just a bit of your secret and the tips on
I don't think I have a secret at all, and I would never claim that I'm necessarily even doing these things right. Um, I think for me, it's all a sort of balancing. I tend to hate the sostenuto pedal, I'm afraid, and I avoid it like the plague because I've had a number of really bad, actually, right before I made the video for you, I wanted to demonstrate it and I checked on the piano. Sure enough, it wasn't just catching the one note, it was catching another note. And when I did my debut recital in New York, I was in Merkin Hall and I'd rented this gorgeous German Steinway and I was playing George Crumb. And George Crumb, you cannot play without the well, the sostenuto didn't work. And the tuner had to come in. We had to start half an hour late while he fixed it. And when I was doing a final DMA lecture recital at Stony Brook, I was supposed to play some Crumb. That's what I'd written about. Sostenuto didn't work. In any case, I've had a lot of bad experiences with it being broken because it's broken more often than it's not. It's apparently a very, very delicate adjustment. So that is not to say you shouldn't use sostenuto in Debussy. If it happens to be working, there are some cases. Pour le piano is the most obvious one, but there's one in General Levine where it's really nice. You get a much more interesting sort of layering of articulation if you use it. Other than that, what do? I cheat often. I just don't hold the bottom note as long as he wrote it. I feel as if Debussy often wrote, some of his notation is like, if only you can imagine this. It's like, it's not as extreme, but there's a place where Schumann writes an inner line and it's not to be played, it's just to be heard by the performer, right? And it's in the humoresque. And I think some of what Debussy writes, at least on modern pianos, is in that realm where you put down the thinnest layer of pedal and you try to keep a remnant of the sound as long as you possibly can. And then you have it ringing in your ears and you hope that by some telepathy it's ringing. That's all I can tell you. I don't think it's always possible, but I also think it's really, really important to try because I find my students it's funny, students generally over pedal, right? But for some reason in Debussy, they always change the pedal much too often and they don't notice that the bass note is actually in some ways a pedal marking. He writes a dotted half note in the bass, and then you have to move the next corner note, you have to move your left hand. Well, the only way to do that is to hold it in the pedal, and that must be what his notation means. So yeah, smoke and mirrors, right? You try your best. And you use whatever tools you have at your disposal. On some pianos, it works much better than on others. And his instruments, he had a number of different instruments, but they were all lighter than the instruments that we tend to play on. And so no doubt he could get away with longer pedals or heavier pedals than we can. But our foot can shake a lot.
What's next for you? What's coming up?
Well, at the moment, I'm just planning trips to 2 festivals in Europe, and I'm so excited to be taking off for Europe, and also to be playing chamber music there again. So it feels like it's been a really long, kind of dry spell, and I've missed it a lot. I've been lucky to be working on this big, great courses series of 24 lecture recitals. So, and that's still coming up. It's not coming out till November, and I still need to go through. I've recorded them, but I still need to go through all the lectures and recitals and hear what they've put together. So that's very much still on my agenda. But for next year, I'm hoping there's quite a lot of chamber music here at Lawrence, and over the summer, I'm doing Brahms piano quartet that then. Actually, an interesting piece by Louise Farrenc. I'm not sure how one says her name even, Farrenc, but she's a 19th century French composer who we don't know nearly enough of. I've just been listening to a bit of a cello sonata, just beautiful. So, I think we're all looking for ways to open up the repertoire as well as ways to go back to the music that is so fundamental and that we love so much.